Hi, good evening, everyone. Sorry, that was a bit loud. Welcome to our session. We're going to start now, so I hope those of you who are ready can have a seat. Also, please note there's Spanish interpretation, so if you like to have a headset, you can collect it at the back of the room to your right, my left. So good evening to all of you here. We're happy to have you here today to join this conversation or to be present, to listen, engage, and learn from these fantastic activists and experts in their own right as they share their valuable information and inputs on loss and damage, human rights, and state and corporate accountability. This conversation is organized by a number of us from various organizations, including La Ruta de Clima, ESCRnet, the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development, also known as APWLD, Climate Action Network Latin America, CAN-LA, the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, also known as IWRAW AP, and the Center for International Environmental Law. Okay, so to just get started, I will just speak a little bit to set the scene, and then we will jump into presentations from our speakers. And then after that, we will give you some space for questions or for you to share different experiences or inputs on what has been shared. So loss and damage remains a critical topic that is under-resourced, unaddressed, and undermined. When we talk about loss and damage, we're not only speaking specifically to the loss of lives or infrastructure or even trees or crops, but we're speaking to both the economic and non-economic losses. Loss of life, yes. Loss of livelihoods, yes. But also the loss of identities, culture and cultural heritage, indigenous and local knowledge, mental stability, and in some cases, or many cases, access to resources inclusive of education, jobs, and health. The impacts of loss and damage are felt significantly by countries in the global south, countries unable to adapt anymore, and also unable to afford to recover from the rapid onset of climate events, and which we've seen so much in the last 2 years, in addition to what we've all just lived through and are still living through the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. These climate events continue to also strike with the changing climate, especially when we're in moments of recovery, as we will see throughout the global south. Ambitious climate policies and adaptation plans by governments at all levels of participation or decision-making do not reflect the realities of those grappling the most with the impacts of extreme weather events. There's also the erasure of the lives and livelihoods of different communities, inclusive of rural, indigenous, and Black communities, but also people living with disabilities, LGBTI people, and other marginalized people who are often not part of the climate discourse. At the UNFCCC COP, world leaders, civil society actors, climate feminists, climate experts, researchers, corporations, and many others have gathered here in Sharm el-Sheikh to discuss and negotiate issues for the possible outcomes of human life and the planet. We believe there's no better space for us to raise the issue of loss and damage that we will hear today, to emphasize the need for integration, to raise the issue of loss and damage, but also to emphasize the need for the integration of human rights and to also demand state accountability, especially for the global south, bearing in mind that the last-minute addition of the loss and damage topic to the COP27 agenda. With that said, climate reparations and a finance facility remain some of the main approaches to ensuring that marginalized communities can at least survive another 50 years. We must agree that world leaders' commitments cannot only be matched with words and statements of concern, support, or solidarity anymore, but also require financial, technical, legal support, and also international cooperation that contributes to their lives and sustainability. A handful or even trillions of dollars specifically will not solve the already exacerbated issue of climate change, but it will address the needs of states' accountabilities to their citizens and the planet. So without further ado, I would like to give my colleagues the floor to share their different experiences and knowledge with you. So first up, we'll have Anna Celestial of the Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment and also a member of the Asia Pacific Network for Environmental Defenders. Anna, over to you.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I would like for all of us to take a minute of silence to remember all those who have experienced tremendous loss in the past decades because of extreme weather events and climate change. We want to dedicate this space, this whole event, to all of them. Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I'm both honored and humbled to be here speaking on behalf of all these communities of women, their families, who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate disasters. Next, please. I will be speaking about Asia-Pacific demands for loss and damage. In Asia-Pacific region, we have 1.2 billion people living on less than $3.20 a day. So we're the poorest region in the world, actually. And of course, our loss and damage is great. It's also grave, and it has intergenerational impacts. With 29% of global disasters happening in our region, we get hundreds of millions of people and their families being displaced and affected whenever climate disaster strikes. Next, please. And of course, women, our families, and our communities bear the brunt of this loss and damage. Women are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and access to resources. The traditional roles of women as food providers, caregivers, and protectors of our territories and resources make us very much affected when food sources are compromised. We also see increased sexual and gender-based violence in typhoon and evacuation centers after typhoons, which affects not just women but also LGBTQIs and girls. These are what we call the non-economic impacts of climate change. Next, please. So loss and damage is not just economic. It's not just quantified or calculated. There is also non-economic loss and damage. These are the types of loss and damage like mental health impacts, cultural and identity impacts, losses to language, losses to identities, losses to indigenous and local knowledge. This is from a study in the Pacific, but it's also happening in the whole of the Asia-Pacific region, and I'm sure in the rest of the world as well. Next, please. That is why we Asia-Pacific women have brought forward our feminist demands for loss and damage. Some of my colleagues are giving out these postcards. You can ask them for it. It's a limited edition postcard. Basically, um, we call on our leaders to address loss and damage, not tomorrow, not many, many more COPs from now, because it's a matter of survival for all of us, but now. Our families, our communities, and our ways of living are being washed away as a consequence of the systemic carbon colonialism by the world's wealthiest and top emitters. So, holding polluters accountable for their past, present, and future loss and damage that we are facing right now is central for women in Asia and the Pacific in our common struggles for climate justice. Next, please. In particular, we demand financing for loss and damages based on needs, with direct access for women and their communities. We also demand that our leaders address the non-economic dimensions of loss and damage as well, including the violation of women's human rights, loss of human lives, and biodiversity. Next, please. So climate and development justice is at the heart of our fight for loss and damage. As the video says, we remember and we will never forget the tremendous loss that we have faced and we will, of course, continue to face. And this is what keeps us going. This is what gives us eternal hope for a better future for our families. As long as we struggle, we fight, we resist, even if they want to silence us, we will persist. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Anna. Up next, we will have Adrian Martinez Blanco of La Ruta de Clima.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody for coming and being here. I know it's a lot of effort and sacrifice of you of being reaching this cup and being at this space. One of the things with loss and damage is that it is a big contradiction that those that are victims are always at the mercy of the perpetrators. The communities that's supposed to be getting justice are fitting their necessities to the agenda of those that have generated that harm. And that is one of the true inequalities or injustices that is structurally the UNFCCC has. We, instead of the victims, the communities setting when and how should they be repaired by the damage that we all know climate change and the carbon-intensive economies have caused to their communities, we instead see those that are responsible not accepting responsibility and become benefactors, become investors, become insurers of those victims that they have harmed. Because climate change is a human-made issue. It's an issue that we know that generates adverse impacts and that is not equally responsible by all communities. But in this space, and we see it with the 3 decades that it has taken for the issue of loss and damage to reach the negotiations. And when we do get the agenda items, how could we celebrate? And we have to think very hard of this. We spent 3 decades just to have an agenda item to talk about it. And then when we get the agenda item in this cup, these inequalities that we know exist are directly expressed by the president of the COP. We cannot talk about liability, we cannot talk about compensation, which are the basis of which are the consequences of transboundary environmental harm, which is what communities are facing on the ground. People that live day-to-day farming or day-to-day in the coastal fishing, that see their houses destroyed, women that are left alone with their communities, with the elderly and the children to face climate change on their own and from their own pockets pay for the damages that here the developed countries such as the United States or the European Union come to set their own rules on how to repair the damage they did. This is a structural injustice of this place. In no other context would you find somebody that goes and destroys your climate, makes your land unlivable, the one who sets the conditions on how to repair and provide justice, but in the UNFCCC. This is the basics of what we find here. Here we have Article 8F from the agenda being set up on what? On a process with detailed rules instead of a process without rules. That is what we had in the Glasgow dialogue. This will not lead to justice because it's the perpetrators just setting their own agenda to avoid taking responsibility. And one of the facts that we have at the UNFCCC is that developed countries, those big carbon historical emitters, have never taken responsibility for the damage that they're causing. But they have taken every route possible, including setting this dialogue in terms of financing loss and damage for 2024 at the UNFCCC, every route possible to divide and prolong the time that it takes to address loss and damage. And what happens when that happens? Human rights violations take place every day in communities around the world. And who benefits? Fossil fuel companies that are also liable for this damage are not held accountable, and countries that are big emitters of carbon get to enjoy one more decade, one more day of not being held liable to the damage that communities pay on loss and damage every day. That is why here, beyond just asking for a facility, what we're asking is for justice, because the UNFCCC is facilitating human rights violations by denying us in Central America our right to remain in our territories, our right to enjoy a dignified life, a life to not fear the climate. Because in many of our communities, even indigenous peoples are no longer able to live off the land as they have had done for hundreds of years, because our environment was changed by the global north. And that's transboundary environmental harm that demands justice. It is clearly understood in the Principle 12 of the Rio Declaration that we should be entitled for reparations and compensations. Only on the understanding of structural injustice of the UNFCCC is that we are no longer equal under the law because we are not from the global north. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Adrian, and I'm happy for both of you, you and Anna, pointing out in terms of the injustices not just happening broadly to the global north, but to the specific communities, and also acknowledging these things as structural and systemic. Next, we'll have Alejandro Aleman from Climate Action Network Latin America to speak to you.
Yes, I will speak Spanish. Trataré de resumir en estos minutos la experiencia de Climate Action Network América Latina y el por qué muchas organizaciones de CANLA, pero también del Foro Centroamérica Vulnerable, estamos poniendo suma atención al tema de pérdidas y daños acá en la COP27. Perdón. Con el apoyo de la organización Christian Aid desde hace alrededor de 15 años, nosotros hemos monitoreado los patrones de clima en algunas comunidades en la búsqueda incesante de opciones de adaptación que permitiesen a las comunidades adaptar sus medios de vida a las nuevas condiciones y patrones climáticos. Hemos encontrado cambios en patrones de precipitación y temperatura que al final terminan inviabilizando los patrones los medios de vida, de las comunidades, en tanto nuestras comunidades, en términos generales, dependen del clima para su sobrevivencia. La mayor parte de ellas de la agricultura, de cultivos como maíz, frijoles, sorgo, etcétera, particularmente en el corredor seco de Centroamérica y algunas zonas de la región andina. Lo que hemos observado en los últimos años es que las opciones, y entramos al tema de pérdidas y daños, porque las opciones de adaptación que hemos estado implementando ya no necesariamente responden a las necesidades de las comunidades. Es decir, los patrones de cambio de clima que hemos observado recientemente rebasan las posibilidades de adaptación de las comunidades. Entonces, desde nuestro punto de vista, continuar hablando de adaptación sí es importante, pero tenemos que hablar del otro tema que es pérdidas y daños, que ocurre, como mencionaba anteriormente, cuando los medios de vida de las comunidades no son viables, tal y como lo hemos conocido por siglos incluso, y las comunidades se ven obligadas a migrar. Centroamérica, particularmente de donde vengo, En los últimos 5 años hemos visto de manera creciente las caravanas de migrantes abarrotarse hacia la frontera con Estados Unidos. La respuesta de Estados Unidos ha sido violencia y deportación en contra de los migrantes climáticos. Y mientras generan violencia y deportación en contra de los migrantes climáticos, en este foro internacional bloquean cualquier posibilidad de abordar un mecanismo que permita compensar a esas comunidades que, como bien Adrian lo ha mencionado, son víctimas de los daños en el clima global. Es por eso que para nosotros la agenda de pérdidas y daños es fundamental en este foro internacional, pero también venimos en la búsqueda de una respuesta en tanto nuestra demanda principal es que en la decisión de la COP27 se logre demandar el establecimiento de un mecanismo financiero para abordar esas pérdidas y daños y finalmente se operacionalice la red de Santiago sobre pérdidas y daños. Desde la perspectiva de las comunidades, nuestro trabajo en las comunidades sentimos que está totalmente desconectado de esta negociación internacional. Parece que estuviéramos en mundos totalmente distintos. El lenguaje, en términos generales, los contextos son totalmente distintos. El lenguaje incluso con el que operacionalizamos la adaptación en las comunidades es muy distinto al lenguaje de las negociaciones y sentimos que hay una falta de conexión. Sin embargo, la urgencia del Finance Facility consideramos que es fundamental, el escalamiento del financiamiento para la adaptación también consideramos que es otro tema fundamental y por supuesto para nosotros es altamente preocupante y un poco extraño el fraccionamiento de las posiciones de los bloques de países como el G77 más China. Uno de los aspectos que desde CAN América Latina y desde el Foro Centroamérica Vulnerable nos preocupa en estas negociaciones internacionales son las desafortunadas intervenciones de algunos países pretendiendo hacernos creer que países como China o la India, por ejemplo, deben de pagar por las pérdidas y daños. Quienes tenemos una mínima noción del tema sabemos que las responsabilidades históricas del norte global, particularmente de los países industrializados, son sumamente distantes de países como China y la India, que todavía tienen amplios segmentos de su población en alta condición de vulnerabilidad. Este tipo de propuestas, desde nuestro punto de vista, únicamente erosionan la posibilidad de mantener la cohesión del sur global y limitan grandemente las posibilidades de lograr resultados satisfactorios en este foro en favor de los pueblos que hoy están sufriendo las pérdidas y daños. Gracias, hasta aquí.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Now we will have Dr. Christopher Bartlett, who is the Climate Diplomacy Manager of the Vanuatu government.
Thank you very much. I have to say, it's really frustrating. I'm the lead negotiator for loss and damage for Vanuatu, and I personally have been involved in this process for 10 years. And to come year after year and have to justify the loss and damage that not only Vanuatu, but now every planet, every country on the planet is experiencing shows that something is not right. Something is broken in this system. For those of you who don't know, Vanuatu was the first country to raise the issue of finance for loss and damage way back in 1991, before we even had this convention. And we raised the issue in terms of sea level rise and compensation for those communities that are absolutely losing their territorial integrity. And it's taken us 31 years, and this COP we had to fight to even discuss the issue, with the qualification that we wouldn't address justice and that we probably won't even have a decision on finance until 2024. This is not right. I am a marine biologist, and I have worked with a community in Vanuatu for a long time, more than 20 years. And this community is a fishing community, and they spend their entire lives and livelihoods on the water. And the reason I got involved in this community was because they wanted to do everything that they could to properly manage their coral reef. And they were particularly concerned about doing everything they could to adapt to the climate crisis. This year, we experienced extreme out-of-season rainfall. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, on October 12th, the entire mountainside of this village collapsed. And it collapsed on top of the village, and it collapsed on the coral reef. Today, their coral reef is gone. That's it. This community has lost its identity as an indigenous fishing community in the Pacific Islands. This is the level of loss and damage that is a reality for so many communities around the world. And we empathize when we see the loss and damage experienced in Europe and in Australia and in North America, because no human being on this planet has been spared. This is unacceptable. The spirit with which countries are approaching climate change under this process does not match reality. And this is why Vanuatu is beginning to question the integrity of this entire process. What we need to do is bring an understanding of obligations to this process. Countries have obligations to protect people and to protect human rights. And if it's not codified in this convention, I guarantee you that it is codified in other conventions. So what Vanuatu is doing, we are approaching the International Court of Justice. This is the United Nations world's highest court, which has the mandate to clarify questions of international law. And so next month, in December, we will put a resolution on the table of the General Assembly to ask the International Court of Justice to, first of all, clarify what the existing obligations are under existing international law, and then tell us what the legal consequences are when significant harm has been created. Friends, we are well on our way to passing that resolution. At the General Assembly, it is unlike the UNFCCC that you need a consensus agreement. If a simple majority, if just the half of the countries in the world vote for this resolution, the International Court of Justice will provide the advisory opinion that we need. We are almost there. We have around 86 countries from Africa, from the Pacific, from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Asia, and even from Europe, who have committed to voting for this resolution. If your country has not yet committed, now is the time. It should hit the floor of the General Assembly in about 3 weeks. Just after we leave COP, we start the final negotiations on that question, and finally, we hope to bring some legal clarification so that the next COP, we're not fighting over clearly non-negotiable legal obligations, but we're starting to address actions to solve the issue of loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for sharing that information. I think it was very valuable information to all of us in the room. And finally, we're going to have Mela Chiponda from Femnet to speak to you before we go into discussion and questions session.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things that we are not talking about is the issue that loss and damage is being paid for. Women are paying for loss and damage. And the payment that women, and not just women, it is the poor women, the indigenous women, the peasants, and the women across Africa. They are the ones who are paying for the loss and damage. And this is why, because the labor of poor women, particularly women in Africa, in the global south, is normalized. The exploitation of their labor is normalized and naturalized and invisibilized, that the whole world thinks it's okay not to talk about loss and damage, because already I come from a community that experienced the most devastating cyclone in the southern hemisphere, the cyclone Idai. In one night, 3,000 people from Zimbabwe's eastern highlands and Beira in Mozambique, they perished in one night. And the damage that was done there, it is something that nobody across the continent had ever seen. And this happened on 15 March 2019. And up to now, people are still homeless. Up to now, the women are still rebuilding their lives. And the dominant narrative is telling everybody that this is a natural disaster. And let me just say, part of the violence that we are facing, the people in the global south and the people in Africa, is that the climate-induced disasters are considered natural disasters, and that is violent. It is violent in the sense that when we look at the IPCC report, last year in 2021, it was tracing the climate crisis to colonialism. And now we are a continent that is both lost and damaged because of the historical injustice that every African person and every person in the global south is carrying because of the historical injustice. And the most violent part of it is that the whole world is forcing us into an amnesia to say, forget about it. It is the past. We need to move forward. And when we look at what are the solutions that are being proffered for loss and damage, we have heard about the very false and cruel solution of saying that you need to have insurance. And where are the insurance companies located? And if this is not colonialism, tell me what is colonialism? Because those insurance companies that African countries and countries in the global south are supposed to put their resources are in the global north. And therefore, we are trusting the corporations that caused the same crisis to solve the crisis through us entrusting them with money instead of them just that even trying to articulate it is the biggest violence that I'm even imagining, that we are actually saying that the corporations are the ones who have caused this crisis that we're sitting with. And let me just say, even for the poor people in the northern world, they are also facing the same devastation. The people that were affected by Hurricane Katrina, a lot of them are still living under the devastation more than 10 years thereafter. And what we are getting is, give us money because we have caused this climate crisis so that when you lose and when there is damage, then we can release that money. And this is, these are part of the solution. I won't even mention about the denial of the world to acknowledge climate refugees. For me, the issue of migration is also adaptation. African countries are facing desertification, and also that when we talk about loss and damage, often we imagine just the extreme weather conditions, which are rapid, and then when it comes to desertification, which is a slow process, the rising sea level, that is a slow process, often that is naturalized, and often that is not considered loss and damage, but people are losing their lands and their territories. Women are losing their livelihoods. And I know the issue of identity has been mentioned already, but as well, we have children who have been orphaned by the climate crisis. We have people that have been impoverished by the climate crisis. And for me, even just having monetary compensation, that's not enough. Because we can't say, now you don't have, we have deprived you of the love of your parents and the love of your community. Now we're giving you this money. This money is going to keep you warm, right? For me, the biggest justice we can do is to close down the fossil fuels industry. Apart from the compensation that we also just close down and make all the polluting corporations take responsibility of their actions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mila. You were right on time, actually. Okay, so I was going to give a question to the speakers, but I think it might be more important to take questions from the audience to the speakers. Do all the speakers agree with that? Okay, great. So is there a mic, first of all? I see there's a hand here, and there are a couple in the back, I think. Yeah, oh, okay. So the mic is coming. Thank you, Basma. And if there's a specific speaker you'd like to ask a question to, feel free to direct that question to them. No, there's no volume from the mic?
Está ya. Ok, bueno, mi pregunta, bueno, tengo dos preguntas. La primera es, ¿cuánto más tendrán que adaptarse nuestros pueblos indígenas? Yo soy de Colombia y ustedes conocen que a nivel mundial tenemos en La Guajira uno de los proyectos de extracción de carbón más grandes del mundo. En ese contexto yo me pregunto, ¿cuánto más tendrán que adaptarse nuestros pueblos indígenas que han sido victimizados, no solamente 1, 2, 3, sino que van a continuar siéndolo? Nosotros nos adaptamos, pero ¿cuánto más seguirán teniendo responsabilidad sobre estos desastres y estas afectaciones a la crisis climática las empresas? Un ejemplo contundente puede ser la medida de las certificaciones para regular la huella de carbón, y esto lo han hecho con la compra de bonos de carbón. Es decir, compramos unas certificaciones en países como el nuestro, sí, porque tenemos bosques para poder vender estos bonos de carbón, pero las empresas siguen contaminando. ¿Quién va a reparar? Porque creo que no tiene precio, no solamente las sequías y estos desastres, sino las pérdidas y daños en el sentido cultural y ancestral. Esa es una pregunta. La segunda tiene que ver más con el aspecto financiero, que también creo que no solamente aquí venimos, es muy importante, como ya lo han referido ustedes, el recurso financiero, pero ¿cuál es el mecanismo judicial, regulador y mundial que vamos a exigir desde la COP27 para exigir la responsabilidad que tienen las empresas sobre los derechos humanos? Sabemos que existen los principios rectores, sabemos que existe la debida diligencia, pero la debida diligencia como un mecanismo desde las empresas no es obligatorio, al contrario, ha servido para hacerle lobby empresarial a estas transnacionales, ha servido para vender su bonita imagen de un programa de derechos humanos en sus empresas. Es decir, que este lenguaje de derechos humanos se ha instrumentalizado también. Entonces, yo creo que con estas dos preguntas, pues me gustaría tener más ilustración. Creo que con la primera y el primer ejemplo que puse, seguimos continuando con la mercantilización de la naturaleza. Estoy de acuerdo con que desastres naturales, sino efectos del abuso del sistema capitalista y corporativo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for your question, Martha. I think I'll take about 2 more questions and then the speakers can answer. So 2 more.
Thank you very much. My name is Zila Malia from Kenya. And for me, this is more of a comment and not a question. And so I'd like to come in especially on the insurance aspect. And I've been involved in that. And what you're saying is that there's no one solution that fits all. We understand as Africans we need to adapt. And I'm from a country that has been affected by the worst drought in the last 70 years. You're seeing our wildlife dying. So I actually feel the plight of Africans and where we're coming from. And considering that our governments do not have the fiscal balance to actually cover loss and damage. So what you're saying is we're creating a mechanism whereby insurance premiums can be paid by donors to cover the most vulnerable populations that are not able to actually pay for their premiums. So what does this do? When you're expecting maybe a cyclone, then parametric insurance through technology can tell you that this might happen. So you get a payout, which then helps you to relocate to safer areas. So it's basically understanding that there's so much that we need to do as Africans, and we need different solutions. We need to have infrastructure. We also need to have risk transfer, and this solution is a market-based solution which is being covered by African insurers who actually understand the risks that are facing us as Africans. So this is just a clarification, and thank you so much for the good panel.
Thank you so much for that. We'll take 1 more question.
Can be succinct with your questions, we don't have much time.
Yes, hi. My name is Gregory Spira. I'm with Care Canada. I serve as head of Gender, Food and Climate Justice Programs. I was just wondering, we directed to a colleague from Asia Pacific Women Law and Development. So the issue of loss and damage and the direct flow of funds to women's rights organizations out of loss and damage is an issue that a lot of us, including CARE, feel strongly about. What I'm wondering, though, is how do we do differently as a sector in asking for this kind of direct flow when it hasn't worked in discussions on adaptation finance? And how do we make something different? How do we sell it to donors, to other actors, so that the importance of loss and damage and direct decision-making of those funds is in the hands of women and women's rights organizations?
Take 1 more, or no?
No, I think we have a response from the speakers, and then we'll take a few more questions. Also, before we go on, just feel free, if we run out of time, to connect with the different speakers, engage, but also exchange information if possible. Who would like to answer first? Anna, would you like me to start with you, or is there anyone who has the burning desire to respond? Alejandro?
Sí, nuevamente voy a hablar español, perdón. ¿Cuánto más tendrán que adaptarse los pueblos indígenas? Reflexionaba nuestra colega de Colombia. Decimos nuestra perspectiva, hablamos de pérdidas y daños precisamente porque la adaptación ya no es factible. Entonces vemos desplazamiento. Los impactos de la variabilidad climática han rebasado las posibilidades de nuestros pueblos de adaptarse. Y yo no estoy seguro si la migración es adaptación. Yo creo que ese es un debate en el que podemos entrar porque caías a la misma reflexión y entonces el acervo cultural y toda la pérdida de costumbres, de medios de vida, de formas de vida, y el quiebre de nuestras raíces y de las condiciones sociales, eso quién lo paga y quién lo valora. Entonces, es sumamente complejo. Por eso, ante la imposibilidad de generar compensaciones al menos por esos elementos que son invaluables y a los que no podemos poner valor económico, incluyendo las pérdidas de vidas humanas y toda nuestra cultura, consideramos que lo mínimo que la comunidad internacional puede hacer por los pueblos indígenas y por las comunidades vulnerables es reconocer la responsabilidad histórica de haber dañado el clima y establecer un compromiso para ese mecanismo, para abordar debidamente las pérdidas y daños, que reitero es lo que nosotros esperaríamos de aquí, de la COP27. Y la respuesta que nos han dado es que van a establecer un diálogo de 2 años para ver si en 2 años se genera una respuesta para abordar las pérdidas y daños. Adrián lo decía, eso es inaceptable, eso es simplemente vergonzoso. En una reunión bilateral que teníamos con uno de los negociadores del sur, decía este diálogo, lo denominado, que vamos a enmarcar el diálogo entonces de pérdida y daños sobre los diálogos de Glasgow, deberíamos de llamarles los diálogos de la hipocresía, porque es un diálogo sumamente hipócrita, es un diálogo sumamente irresponsable. Entonces, poco difícil encontrar respuesta a todos estos elementos que no tienen valor económico, pero ante esas dificultades, al menos debería de haber una respuesta moralmente aceptable, reitero, particularmente de parte del norte global, y aprovechar la ocasión para llamar a las cosas por su nombre. Estados Unidos y Canadá, por favor, dejen de bloquear las conversaciones sobre pérdidas y daños. Señor John Kerry, por favor, deje de bloquear, permita que se continúe conversando y que se llegue a buen puerto en las conversaciones sobre pérdidas y daños. Dicen que mañana viene Biden y yo creo que valdría la pena hacer una acción pública para darle a conocer a Biden que no estamos de acuerdo con lo que su gobierno está haciendo en materia de pérdidas y daños. Y no solo a Biden, también otros actores de la comunidad internacional que se escudan. Sabemos que es Estados Unidos y Canadá quienes dan la cara, pero la Unión Europea se escuda detrás de estos dos países. Entonces es importante aprovechar este momento para ejercer mayor presión también sobre esos actores y que puedan dar una respuesta moralmente aceptable y no caigamos en ese diálogo de la hipocresía que han llamado los diálogos de Glasgow. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Adrian? Okay, we can have Anna and then Adrian and then any other, Mela, okay. Go ahead.
First, I want to address the question by Marta on adaptation. I just want to add that when we say adaptation, we mean being able to adapt to face the impacts, right? But at the core of adaptation actually is the economic conditions of our peoples and our communities. So basically, the issue of adaptation is closely tied to wealth inequalities, to poverty. As long as we are kept impoverished, our peoples are kept impoverished because of the unequal wealth relations, because of colonialisms. I think it will be very hard for us, peoples, indigenous peoples, farmers, workers who are really exploited right now by capital to adapt. So here comes our central message actually of when we see climate justice, we also want to see system change because it's really at the heart of everything. We really need to change the system. And we know it's hard, but we do it bit by bit. And then for the question of, I didn't get your name, sorry, about financing for loss and damage. I know it's very sticky, very, very, very sticky issue right now. Imagine the issue of climate financing for adaptation was already sticky, and we even have an even difficult negotiations ahead for financing for loss and damage. Personally, I must admit I am not I do not follow all of the negotiations, but I agree with you that it is very important to have women and women organizations represented at all levels of decision making, of approving, of management of different loss and damage aspects, especially finance. But I think the key for us here is we need women's organizations, women, especially those from the grassroots, also monitoring what is happening. I know hour by hour, day by day for this particular COP, changes are so fast and developments are happening so fast. So I think we need to stick to our guns and persist, really. We need to keep our eye on the ball. I know it's kind of frustrating, you know, it's sometimes you want to give up, but we have to keep our eye on the ball. And actually, related to Marta's question on how we can, how we can, mechanisms at the national and global levels. I think even in terms of financing for loss and damage, one thing we can do is, especially for us in the global south, at the national level, we lobby our governments to take positions that are favorable to us, favorable to the peoples. As what Chris mentioned, we should support the resolutions of our fellow developing countries and those fellow countries in the global south, because we know that there's a big mafia of developed countries, you know, blocking every step of the way, all those kinds of reforms that they want to happen. So I think I really believe there is strength in numbers. So when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to wanting to put our language, we really need to, even before COP, to lobby our leaders, our delegations, and our governments. I hope I'm not really very privy to the finance discussion, so I'm sorry if I'm not able to answer your question fully. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. One of the things that I always think about loss and damage is about the people that do not move from their communities, and the idea of the right to remain despite being risky. And it also is a reflection on why we keep talking about compensation and liability. And it's because we don't adapt to injustice. When we stop talking about our rights, we lose them. And that's why, despite 3 decades and more of the US and its allies of denying us the basic right to reparations, and for them to accept the responsibility, the legal responsibility for loss and damage, we keep talking about it. And it has taken me 8 years to understand the structural immorality of being able to listen to the president of a COP talk about denying me my rights, about the common nature of this place where mentioning human rights, it's something unusual and unviable. So it is no longer just immoral, but it's anti-juridical. It goes against international law, and it goes publicly denying our rights. And then when we talk about insurance, I then come to realize, why would I get insured for living in my own land? Why should I be afraid of living on my own land? I should be afraid because those developed countries made an economic scheme where I take the risk and they took the profits. And now I have to be insured to live in my own backyard. That is not right. I ain't paying no insurance. At least give me those profits back, because now I won't be able to have my climate back, my way of life back. So no, I say no to Global Shield. I say no to profit in insurance, because I will not pay to be afraid in my own land. That is the basic stupid thing about insurance.
Thank you. I think there are 2 questions maybe that I want to respond to about how do we make the institutions, that have caused the climate crisis, how do we ensure that they're accountable? Let me just give the example of corporations. Corporations, we all say that corporations, they have a legal persona. What do we do to people that commit genocide, for example? For me, that is genocide. Wiping out whole communities because you want to make profit, because we are putting profit ahead of the people. So where is the Hague? Where is the ICC? Because for me, this is genocide. So I'm just thinking through what is the most logical way. Why are we not using the institutions that we have put in place to make sure that institutions and people do not do harm to other people? And as well, I was discussing yesterday, I work in movements, the ESCRnet, which I'm a part of, is a movement, has a lot of members who are coming from social movements, who are living the climate crisis. I'm also part of FemNet, which is a women's rights organization that is working with women who are living the climate crisis. And often there's the discussion about how do we make sure that the polluting countries pay. They should stop trying to sanitize all this. They should stop investing in research to justify not paying. They have spent millions trying to sanitize, trying to shift the responsibility to the victims of their actions. And those billions are just supposed to compensate and pay. And last of all, there is no green military. The world should just stop investing in military. They should stop investing in weapons of mass destruction, because military institutions are emitting more greenhouse gases than the whole continent of Africa. And therefore, one of the solutions is stop militarization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mela. Any other questions? We could take a few more. We have one in the Basma. I think we had her first, and then we come back to Radiatu, and yeah. So we have 3 more.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Hello? Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Dana Ahmed. My question is concerning a very niche community, I think, that has not really been discussed as much, which is why I'm trying to raise more awareness, and I really hope the panel would consider my question. So this question is concerning education. I think we can all agree, based on what everyone has said, that education is a very important part in loss and damage, whether that is incorporating indigenous knowledge in education firms or increasing loss and damage and awareness through implementing it on an international level for youth to access. According to the National Autistic Society, people with autism are 3 times more likely to be victims of abuse or aggression. And the increase in societal stress generated because of climate change works as a stressor, aggravating the risk of violence suffered by this group. The intensity of sensory crisis in people with ASD directly impacts their quality of life, bringing negative results in social interaction and communication. This adversity in socialization results in difficulties in escaping or evacuating environmental disasters that are caused by loss and damage, such as hurricanes, floods, and cyclones, and even loss and damage that is caused through a matter of time, such as desertification and rise in sea levels. This generates disproportionately higher rates of morbidity and mortality in people on the autism spectrum. And the lack of autistic-friendly educational resources, coupled with the global financial inefficiency to the right to education for those on the spectrum, has generated a high dropout rate in children and young people with autism, thus limiting access to knowledge, resources, and services that directly links to loss and damage. So this deprives them of the tools they need to empower and respond effectively to loss and damage. So given the impact on the community, my question is, how does the panel think we can make education about loss and damage more accessible, and particularly indigenous knowledge to be more accessible to people on the spectrum of autism? Thank you.
So, thank you so much to the panelists. My name is Radiatu, and I come from Liberia. And I'm so happy to be here, especially listening to all of you panelists. I would normally say that the stories are the same. It's just happening in different regions. So listening to Anna and watching the videos and listening to all of you, it is clear to us that we need to move forward. I understand that this discussion for loss and damage to be placed on the agenda has taken so many years. Now that the discussion has been placed on the agenda, our demands are finance for loss and damage. My question and concern here is, have we considered, or are these discussions considering the liability issues of loss and damage to be placed in these discussions? Because as we are here, we are speaking, loss and damage are ongoing. People are dying. Their properties are going. And it will continue to go. So are we, or how is this discussion considering liability issues of loss and damage? We saw the video. We saw women. We saw how much these people are suffering. And like, I don't know, but I think the suffering is going to continue up to the next COP and even beyond. What are we doing to consider the fact that I know our people are suffering now, but when we speak of justice, when we are able to ensure that these liability issues are considered when we talk about financing loss and damage, then we are moving somewhere. Thank you.
One more question. Right here, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Tine. I'm from Nigeria. My question is directed to the colleague from Vanuatu, where he talked about an indigenous community that got submerged by the landslide. And I was wondering, the case that is to be taken to the international court, is it as it relates to that particular community's loss and damage, or it's the entire global loss and damage situation?
Okay, does anyone from the panel want to start first? Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thank you to my colleague from Nigeria for that question. So let me clarify that this initiative to bring climate change to the International Court of Justice is not a typical litigation case. So Vanuatu is not going to name any countries. We're not going to seek any damages. There's going to be no winners or losers. Rather, what the International Court of Justice does will clarify the legal obligations that all states have to protect human rights against the adverse effects of climate change. So it's very unlike other courts. That said, once the International Court of Justice does provide an advisory opinion, which makes it very clear what those legal responsibilities and consequences are, I would expect that there will be many, many litigation cases that use that guidance and hold those responsible. So this particular village, the village of Molboy, who lost its entire identity, the village, the reef, relocated, is not going to be a part of this particular case. However, when we go to the Court of Justice, I am sure that we will tell the judges how this village has lost its human rights to food, its human rights to water, its human rights to shelter, and its right to exist in its territorial boundaries. So we will provide that testimony to the court to hope to influence their advisory opinion, which would then be useful to all states. I wanted also to say something about the liability related to businesses. So our question is about states. What are states' obligations? But states have an obligation to regulate the activities that occur within their boundaries. And if companies are doing things that compromise human rights, and states are allowing it, condoning it, funding it, subsidies for fossil fuels, they are absolutely breaking legal obligations under law to protect human rights from transboundary harm. And so I very much expect that the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice will have strong implications, not just for countries, but for those businesses that operate within the boundaries of those countries. So I think this is very important for shifting the needle on the discussion of loss and damage.
Thank you, Christopher. Sure, Adrian?
Yes, and with your questions about liability, the fact is that if we don't have things like the initiative Vanuatu is taking, we have been here for decades in processes to avoid liability and maintain profits at the risk of communities and the global south. That is the main logic of the UNFCCC. Have we had before spaces where we thought we're going to have a decision or a mechanism where we might get an answer? Yes, we have. For example, the WIM. We're supposed to have gotten something years ago, but we did not. Because the idea is that developed countries and big country emitters are avoiding responsibility on purpose. And eventually, logically, you would think that we wouldn't have to go to a court or to the ICJ to have our basic human rights and international law respected within the UNFCCC, but we don't. We have not had that. Instead, we have gotten clauses like paragraph 51 of decision 1 of the Paris Agreement that tell us otherwise, the complete opposite of what Vanuatu is seeking for a judge to clarify, despite being incredibly common sense and accepted that we should not be subjected to harm due to the actions of an economic action or sector. And yet, again, our rights are not protected by the UNFCCC because we are not seen as rights holders. We're not seen as persons or rights holders that should access the right to a healthy environment or access justice through the UNFCCC, despite also knowing that only through a multilateral mechanism can we ever get the help we need for the scale that we require help in terms of loss and damage. We could go to court many times eventually, but only the UNFCCC could provide the scale of retribution and aid that we need. But until the time the US acknowledges liability and compensate instead of pretending to be donors and investors to their own victims, we won't be there.
Thank you, Adrian. Alejandro?
Yes, I will answer the question on how to make more accessible education on loss and damage to indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think this has to do with the fact that how much loss and damage is being integrated in NDCs and other national climate policies. Our perspective is that loss and damage as a third pillar of the climate change negotiations should be integrated in the national determined contributions. And in that elements of education for local communities and indigenous peoples should be also integrated. If we integrate loss and damage in the NDCs, it is expected that the rest of the national policy framework related to climate change and sustainable development should be harmonized, including the policies on education, health, infrastructure, etc. So in this regard, the work of civil society is not only important on our perspective here in the UNFCCC, but also at national level, particularly in developing countries, so that we can guarantee that these elements of loss and damage are integrated in our national policy frameworks, especially and beginning on the national determined contributions.
Thank you, Alejandro. Anything else from the speakers? Anna?
Hello? Okay. I was just about to sing. Anyway, I just want to touch on the issue also of education. I think education is a basic human right, and I think it's the obligation of our state, of our states, to make sure that climate change education is included in the curriculum of our youth, because it's a central problem. It's one of the biggest problems we are facing right now. And from our experience in APWLD, when we have our South to South feminist learning with different women all over Asia Pacific, a common sentiment among many grassroots women is that climate change is only being talked about at the COP. It's only being talked about at SCAP in Asia Pacific. But the community women, the community members have no idea what climate change is, but it is really affecting them in a very serious and grave way. So on one hand, I think we should pressure our governments to include climate change education in our basic curricula, especially for our primary school students. And we have actually a very vibrant youth movement who can also push for this at the national levels. Thank you.
Thank you for that point. Martha, I think I see you have another question, but we have 2 more minutes. Sorry, I can't hear. Okay. All right, so we...
Ya, lo siento. Solo quisiera comentar a manera de mi propia conclusión que las empresas son internacionales, las que ocasionan tantos daños. Los bienes naturales en este contexto de crisis climática no le pertenecen a un solo país, sino al mundo. En este sentido, la regulación y la penalización debe ser internacional y universal. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for that final point, Martha. And thank you for all the speakers and everyone in the audience, but also those who posed questions to the speakers. And now to close out, as we're running out of time, we have a final video by the Asia Pacific Forum for Women, Law and Development.
Dear Matafele Benum, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an egg and bald as the Buddha. Your thighs that are thunder, shrieks that are lightning, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks along the lagoon. Dear Matafele Benum, I want to tell you about that lagoon, that lucid, sleepy lagoon lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day, that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of your seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander rootless, with only a passport to call home. Dear Matafele Benum, don't cry. Mommy promises you, no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas, no backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals, no blindfolded bureaucracies gonna push this mother ocean over the edge. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's gonna become a climate change refugee. Or should I say, no one else. To the Carteret Islanders of Papua New Guinea and to the Taro Islanders of Fiji, I take this moment to apologize to you. We are drawing the line here. Because baby, we are going to fight. Your mommy, daddy, boo-boo, dimma, your country, and your president too, we will all fight. And even though there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist, that the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, and Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and floods of Pakistan, Algeria, and Colombia, and hurricanes, tidal waves, and earthquakes didn't exist, still, there are those who see us, hands reaching out, fists raising up, banners unfurling, megaphones booming, and we are canoes blocking coal ships. We are the radiance of solar villages. We are the rich, clean soil of the farmer's past. We are petitions blooming from teenage fingertips. We are families biking, recycling, reusing, engineers dreaming, designing, building, artists painting, dancing, writing. We are spreading the word. And there are thousands out on the street, marching with signs, hand in hand, chanting for change now. They're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us. Because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. Dear Mata Filipinum, you were eyes heavy with drowsy weight. So just close those eyes, baby, and sleep in peace. Because we won't let you down. You'll see.
Thank you for that, APWLD. For me, it's always a very emotional video when I watch it, and I'm sure it was for many of you in the audience. But once again, I want to thank all of our speakers this evening, Anna Celestial, Adrian Blanco, Alejandro Alaman, Dr. Christopher Bartlett, and Mela Chapanda for being here today, but also for all of you for being a part of this conversation. Thank you.